Hey guys, tonight we're rewinding the clock way back, past your great-great-great-grandparents, landing with a squelch right in the heart of 18th century Eastern Europe. Picture this, not the glamorous balls and powdered wigs of Versailles, but the muddy, wind-whipped villages scattered across Serbia, Hungary, Transylvania, places where life was already pretty much on hard mode. And tonight we're diving headfirst into the bizarre, slightly terrifying, and honestly kinda weird phenomenon known as the Great Vampire Panic. Buckle up, or rather, snuggle down, because understanding why perfectly sane people started staking corpses requires us to first breathe the air of absolute dread that made it all possible. Honestly, you might be kinda glad you weren't born back then. The odds of making it through your first week without catching something nasty were dicey at best. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Seriously, no pressure, but it does help this little corner of historical weirdness keep going. And hey, while you're tapping that screen, drop a comment below telling me what city you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love picturing where this story is drifting off to sleep tonight. Are you in Tokyo at noon, London at midnight, somewhere cozy with rain pattering outside? Let me know. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Hey guys, tonight we're rewinding the clock way back, past your great-great-great-grandparents, landing with a squelch right in the heart of 18th century Eastern Europe. Picture this, not the glamorous balls and powdered wigs of Versailles, but the muddy, wind-whipped villages scattered across Serbia, Hungary, Transylvania, places where life was already pretty much on hard mode. And tonight we're diving headfirst into the bizarre, slightly terrifying, and honestly kinda weird phenomenon known as the Great Vampire Panic. Buckle up, or rather, snuggle down, because understanding why perfectly sane people started staking corpses requires us to first breathe the air of absolute dread that made it all possible. Honestly, you might be kinda glad you weren't born back then. The odds of making it through your first week without catching something nasty were dicey at best. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Seriously, no pressure, but it does help this little corner of historical weirdness keep going. And hey, while you're tapping that screen, drop a comment below telling me what city you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love picturing where this story is drifting off to sleep tonight. Are you in Tokyo at noon, London at midnight, somewhere cozy with rain pattering outside? Let me know. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. That held breath finally shatters. It starts, as these things often do, not with a dramatic thunderclap, but with a choked whisper that ripples through the terrified village like a cold draft under a door. Someone, maybe the grieving widow Marja, maybe the nervous shepherd boy Luca, who always saw shapes in the mist, points a trembling finger towards the graveyard on the hill. It's him. The whisper becomes a murmur, then a hiss. Old Maludin. He doesn't rest. He feeds. The accusation lands with the weight of a millstone. Old Maludin. Buried maybe 6 weeks ago, during the worst of the sickness. A large, gruff man in life, known for a temper as fiery as his red beard. His death hadn't been peaceful. A sudden, racking fever took him quick. And now people swear his wife, Anna, wasting away in her bed just 2 huts down, cries out his name in her fever dreams, claiming he visits her at night, heavy and cold, stealing her breath. Others whisper of livestock found weak and bloodless near his grave. The circumstantial evidence, in the supercharged atmosphere of fear and grief, becomes damning. The spark has found its tinder. Now, dim your mental lights a bit further. You're not just hearing about this anymore. You're in it. The decision is made quickly, fueled by a desperate, collective panic that overrides individual doubt. The village elders, the weathered blacksmith, the stern widower who lost 3 children, the priest whose face is etched with lines deeper than scripture gather. There's no formal vote, just a grim consensus reached under the grey, oppressive sky. Maludin's grave must be opened. Today. Before sunset. Before he gets stronger. You find yourself swept along in the grim procession. You're not a grave digger, maybe you're just a neighbor, a cousin, someone whose presence lends weight to this awful necessity. Your boots slip on the muddy path leading up to the churchyard. The air is colder here, the wind carrying the faint, damp scent of disturbed earth from other, fresher graves. The graveyard itself is a patchwork of mounds, some marked with simple wooden crosses already tilting, others raw and bare. Maludin's plot is one of the latter. The tools are basic: shovels, a rough wooden pry bar. The men tasked with digging usually strong, now their movements are jerky with nerves hesitate for only a moment before striking the earth. The rhythmic thunk-thunk-thunk of the shovels biting into the damp soil is the only sound besides the wind and the ragged breathing of the onlookers. You stand at the edge of the pit, the cold mud seeping through the sole of your worn boot. The smell intensifies loam, decay, a cloying sweetness that makes your stomach clench. It's not just the fear, it's the literal smell of the grave. Mainstream history nudge. Exhumations driven by vampire fears weren't secret, shameful affairs. They were often public, communal events, sometimes even ordered or sanctioned by low-level authorities or priests pressured by terrified populations. Detailed reports like the later, famous Visum et Repertum from Medvedgia describe the process, the digging, the observations of the corpse, the remedial actions taken. These weren't hidden rituals. They were desperate acts of communal self-defense, documented with a chilling matter-of-factness. The shovels hit wood. The crude coffin lid, made of planks hastily nailed together during the epidemic's peak, is exposed. The diggers pause, wiping sweat, or is it fear from their brows? The priest murmurs a prayer, clutching his cross, but his eyes are wide, fixed on the coffin. Using the pry bar, they lever the lid open. The sound of splintering wood is unnaturally loud. A collective gasp, sharp and sudden, ripples through the crowd. A wave of that thick, sweet rotten smell washes over you, making your eyes water. You lean forward, compelled by the same morbid dread gripping everyone else. And you see old Maludin. He does not look like a man buried 6 weeks in plague-ridden soil. That's the first, terrifying shock. You expect, well, decomposition. But his face, once ruddy, is bloated, stretched tight like overfilled sausage skin, tinged an unnatural, dark purple. His lips are drawn back, not in a snarl exactly, but revealing teeth that seem startlingly white and prominent against the dark flesh. His eyes, they're open. Or rather, the lids are swollen, pulled back, exposing dull, clouded orbs that seem to stare blankly upwards. But the most horrifying detail, a trickle of dark, viscous fluid, not bright red blood, but something thicker, darker, almost black, has seeped from the corner of his mouth, staining his beard and the rough shroud beneath his chin. Look! Someone hisses, pointing a shaking finger. Fresh blood. He has fed. Weird little nugget, that fresh blood almost certainly not blood. When a body decomposes internally, gases build up, causing bloating. This pressure can force decomposing bodily fluids, a mixture often dark red or brown due to breakdown, up and out of natural orifices like the nose and mouth. It might even seep into the burial shroud, looking alarmingly like a bloodstain. To terrified, grief-stricken villagers who expected a desiccated skeleton, this level of preservation and the leaking fluid was utter, terrifying proof of the unnatural. They called it the vampire's feast, but it was just grisly biology. The panic is instant and electric. Women wail and cross themselves violently. Men curse, backing away, brandishing shovels like weapons. The priestess' prayers become louder, more fervent, almost desperate. The initial dread solidifies into absolute, bone-chilling certainty. The whispers were true. The nightmares were real. Maludin is a vampire. Vrikolakis, the local terms start flying. He didn't decay because he's undead. The dark fluid is the blood of his victims. Poor Anna, the weakened livestock. His bloated state proof he's gorged himself. The open eyes he's watching them, even now. Every natural process of decay has been twisted, through the lens of terror and pre-existing folklore, into evidence of the supernatural. Scholars still debate. Historians and anthropologists note significant regional variations in what constituted a vampire corpse. In some areas, a lack of decomposition was the key sign. In others, rapid decomposition could also be suspect. Hair or nails seeming to grow post-mortem and other decomposition effects. Skin retracts might be a sign in one village, while a ruddy complexion caused by blood pooling due to gravity was the giveaway elsewhere. There wasn't one universal vampire checklist. Local fears and interpretations shaped the evidence. The core horror, however, the dead preying on the living, remained constant. You stand frozen, the image of Maludin's bloated, leaking face burned into your mind. The rational part of you, the part that remembers Maludin as just a grumpy old farmer, screams that this is madness. But the sheer weight of the collective terror, the visceral wrongness of the scene, the priestess' fear, the suffocating smell, it crushes that voice. The evidence is there, staring back with clouded eyes. The whispers solidify into a roar in your own head. He is unclean. He is dangerous. He must be stopped. The question hangs thick in the graveyard air, heavier than the stench. What do you do with such a thing? The answer isn't long in coming. The blacksmith is already muttering about sharpening stakes. The widower spits on the ground near the grave. The priest closes his prayer book with a decisive snap. They look at each other, then back at the abomination in the pit. The decision is unanimous, grim, and terrifyingly practical. They want to just rebury him. They need to make sure he stays down permanently. The tools for that grim task aren't shovels anymore. They're about to get a lot more symbolic and pointy. The descent into ritual violence begins at the edge of this muddy pit, under a sky that offers no comfort. That descent begins not with a roar, but with the grating, rhythmic scrape of stone on metal. You follow the grim procession back down from the blighted graveyard, not to the village square for solace, but straight to the blacksmith's forge. The air here is thick with the familiar sense of coal smoke and hot iron, but tonight, they're undercut by something sharper, fear, and a terrifying sense of purpose. The blacksmith, usually a steady, practical man, moves with a fevered intensity. He's not shoeing a horse or mending a plowshare. He's selecting a thick, green-cut ash sapling, strong, resilient wood. With brutal efficiency, he strips the bark and begins shaping one end into a vicious point using his grinding stone. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound is unnerving, deliberate. Each pass of the stone against the wood feels like it's grinding down your own nerves. This isn't carpentry, it's weapon crafting for the dead. The villagers gather, a tight, silent knot of shadows thrown long and grotesque by the forge's flickering fire. Their eyes reflect the flames, wide, fearful, but now hardened with a desperate resolve. The image of Maludin, bloated and leaking that dark fluid, is seared into everyone's mind. There's no debate, no discussion of alternatives. The logic, in their terror-stricken minds, is horrifyingly clear: the dead man walks. He feeds. He must be stopped. Permanently. And the tools for this grim task aren't found in holy books or apothecary jars tonight. They're forged in fire, pulled from fields, and plucked from kitchen gardens. This is folk magic meets communal survival instinct, raw and immediate. Mainstream history nudge: these anti-revenant practices weren't invented during the 18th century panic. They were deeply rooted in centuries-old Slavic and Balkan folk beliefs about death and the restless dead. The methods varied regionally, but the core idea was universal: physically prevent the corpse from rising or disable its ability to harm the living. This wasn't seen as desecration by the villagers, though authorities and the church later often disapproved. It was a vital, necessary act of protection for the entire community. Think of it as extreme pest control for the supernatural. The sharpened ash stake is the centerpiece, but it's not the only tool laid out with grim ceremony. Someone produces a heavy, curved sickle, the kind used for harvesting wheat. Its blade gleams dully in the firelight. Another villager arrives, clutching a bunch of pungent garlic bulbs, their papery skins rustling in his trembling hand. You see a coil of rough rope, a heavy mallet, maybe a large knife. It looks less like an exorcism kit and more like a macabre parody of farming and butchering implements. The symbolism is visceral, born of the world they know: the stake to pin the evil to the earth, the sickle to decapitate, rendering the body powerless, unable to see its way back home, the garlic to poison or repel the unclean spirit, the rope to bind the corpse, just in case. The procession back up the hill feels heavier, slower, burdened by the tools of execution. The moon, if it's out, offers cold, indifferent light. Reaching the open grave feels like stepping onto a stage for a dreadful play. The coffin lid lies splintered aside. Maludin's bloated form is still there, seemingly untouched by the commotion, staring blankly at the stars he shouldn't be able to see. The smell is worse now, mixed with the sweat and adrenaline of the living. The strongest men are pushed forward. Hesitation flickers, but the collective will is too strong. Using poles or sheer brute force, they haul the unervingly heavy corpse out of the coffin and onto the muddy ground beside the grave. It lands with a soft, wet thud. The sight is grotesque, inhuman. The blacksmith steps forward, the sharpened ash stake held like a lance. He doesn't hesitate. He positions the point over Maludin's chest. Folklore often specified the heart, but sometimes the stomach, the seat of hunger, was targeted. The mallet is raised. Thud. The sound is sickeningly solid. Wood meeting flesh, then grating against bone beneath. The corpse jerks a ghastly, involuntary spasm caused by the impact and the release of pent-up gases. To the villagers, it's a final, violent protest. A gasp, half relief, half horror, escapes the crowd. Sometimes, it was reported that a sigh or groan escaped the corpse at this moment, almost certainly escaping decomposition gases forced through the throat. But in this charged silence, it sounds like the death rattle of the demon within. Weird little nugget: the choice of wood mattered. Ash was popular for its strength, but hawthorn associated with protection against evil, oak strength and sacredness, maple and even blackthorn were used in different regions. The stake wasn't always driven through the heart, sometimes it was hammered straight down through the mouth, specifically to silence the vampire and stop its cries that could summon others. Efficiency met symbolism in the grimmest way possible. Next comes the sickle. A different man steps up, his face pale but set. He positions the curved blade against Maludin's swollen neck. It takes several heavy, hacking blows. The reality is brutal, messy, far from the clean slice of legend. The head rolls partially free, connected by gristle. The villagers flinch but hold their ground. This, they believe, is crucial. A headless body can't find its way back to the village. It can't recognize its victims. It's rendered directionless, impotent. Finally, the garlic bulbs are roughly broken open, releasing their sharp, pungent odor that momentarily cuts through the grave stench. Cloves are shoved unceremoniously into the corpse's mouth, crammed into the gaping wound in its chest, sometimes scattered over the body or placed in the empty eye sockets. The symbolism is layered. Garlic was believed to be inherently pure, repellent to evil spirits. But practically, its strong antibacterial properties meant it actually did help mask the smell of decay, perhaps offering a small, unintended comfort to the living performing this grisly task. Someone might even shove a brick or large stone into the mouth, another method to stop the vampire from biting or crying out. Scholars still debate. The order of these operations varied wildly and is hotly debated by folklorists. Was decapitation done before or after staking? Did garlic go in the mouth before the stake was driven to stop the scream? Was the body turned face down? The lack of a standardized vampire hunting manual meant practices were highly localized, passed down through oral tradition, and adapted based on immediate fears and available tools. What was consistent was the intent to utterly destroy the corpse's perceived ability to function as a predator. The body, now violated, pinned, dismembered, and stuffed with kitchen herbs, is unceremoniously rolled back into the grave. Dirt is shoveled on top with frantic speed, as if burying the evidence of their own collective terror. The mound is patted down hard. A heavy stone might be placed on top. The priest says prayers, but they sound hollow over the sound of shovels hitting earth. Relief washes over the crowd, palpable but brittle. They've done it. They've slain the monster. Anna will recover now, they whisper. The sickness will stop. You stand there, the smell of garlic clinging to your clothes, mixed with mud and the lingering sweetness of decay. The rational voice inside you screams louder now. It was just a body. A rotting corpse. But the fervent belief radiating from the villagers, the sheer visceral horror of what you witnessed, the logic of their actions within their shattered world, it leaves you shaken. You helped. You watched. You were part of it. The line between barbarism and self-preservation feels terrifyingly thin, smeared with mud and something darker. They believe the evil is buried. But the fear that's not buried. It's loose. It's contagious. And in a world connected by terrified whispers and muddy roads, it won't stay confined to this one graveyard, or this one village. The cure, you realize with a sinking dread, might be worse than the disease. That brittle relief won't last. The whispers have wings, and panic is about to take flight. That brittle relief, born in the mud and garlic stench of Maludin's grave, shatters faster than thin ice under a heavy boot. You feel it before you see it, a subtle shift in the air of the village itself. The frantic activity subsides, replaced by a watchful, brittle silence. People move quickly between huts, eyes darting, conversations hushed and urgent. They believe they've solved their problem, but the seed of terror, watered by their own violent ritual, has already sprouted thick, choking roots. And seeds, as any farmer knows, are made to scatter. It starts with the peddler. Old Janos arrives a few days later, his creaking cart piled with pots, ribbons, and crucially, news. He stops at the well, accepting a cup of water. He hears the whispers, sees the lingering fear in eyes that refuse to meet his. He hears the story of Maludin, the bloated corpse, the fresh blood, the stake, the sickle, the garlic. His eyes widen. He nods gravely. he rasps, leaning in conspiratorially. Heard tell of the same, over by Duboka Way. Just last week. Farmer Petrovic, buried not a month. Dug him up swollen like a drowned pig, blood on his lips. They had to stake him and burn the heart, else the whole village be sucked dry by now. His story isn't quite the same as Maludin's, different location, different method burning the heart. Different name, but the core elements are terrifyingly familiar: the unnatural corpse, the threat, the necessary violence. The peddler departs, carrying the tale along with his wares to the next hamlet, embellishing details for better impact, solidifying the pattern. Mainstream history nudge: this period saw a significant increase in regional travel and communication compared to earlier centuries. Peddlers, soldiers moving between posts, seasonal laborers, postal riders, though slower than you'd think, and even pilgrims carried news and rumors across borders. Printed pamphlets and early newspapers in cities like Vienna would later amplify this, but initially, it was word of mouth that turned local incidents into a regional epidemic of fear. The speed was shocking for the time. A panic that might have stayed local in 1600 could engulf a province by 1730. Information and misinformation traveled faster than the plague itself. You witness the transformation. The specific horror of Maludin, anchored in your village's grief and trauma, begins to detach. The details blur. The name changes. The methods used to cure him become standardized in the retelling, morphing into a sort of horrific recipe: dig up the suspicious corpse. If bloated, leaking, ruddy vampire. Stake it. Decapitate it. Garlic the mouth. Burn it if possible. Maludin ceases to be a grumpy old farmer and becomes an archetype: the vampire. A symbol. A catch-all explanation for any misfortune. A cow dies mysteriously, not disease, not a wolf, a vampire drained it in the night. Young Marta falls into a wasting sickness. She must have been visited by her dead uncle Jovan, buried last spring. A sudden hailstorm ruins the barley crop. Clearly, the restless dead are angering the heavens. The logic is terrifyingly circular and self-fulfilling. Any unexplained death, illness, or disaster becomes prima facie evidence of a vampire's presence. And the only proof needed: digging up a corpse and finding, well, any sign of decomposition that doesn't match their expectations. Because after Maludin, everyone expects the bloating, the blood, the ruddy skin. They see it even when it's less pronounced. Confirmation bias runs rampant. Weird little nugget: the panic created a bizarre kind of vampire epidemiology. Villages wouldn't just react to their own suspected vampire, they'd preemptively dig up recently buried corpses from neighboring villages if they suspected the infection was spreading. Imagine the horror: men from village A marching into village B's graveyard, demanding to exhume Grandma Sophia because they heard a rumor she might be turning, just in case her restlessness was causing their own sheep to die. Territorial disputes over graveyards became a real, grim side effect. The landscape itself starts to feel haunted. Travelers avoid certain routes near known vampire villages after dark. Stories proliferate at market days, growing taller with each telling: vampires that fly as owls or mist, vampires that control wolves, vampires immune to garlic requiring more extreme measures. Fear breeds isolation, and isolation breeds more fear. A neighboring village, hearing the rumors from yours and Janosch the peddler, experiences its own sudden death. Panic seizes them. They don't wait for wasting sickness or nightmares. They recall the signs they heard about: bloating, blood. They dig up their own recent dead, perhaps someone who died peacefully of old age. Finding the natural, but still unsettling, signs of early decomposition which, let's face it, always looks a bit off. they interpret it through the lens of the vampire template they've absorbed. The cycle repeats. Violence is done. The proof is confirmed. The panic spreads. It feeds on itself. Scholars still debate, how much did genuine, widespread belief drive this, versus cynical manipulation or mass hysteria. Some argue local leaders or even priests might have encouraged exhumations to redirect blame for misfortunes away from their own failings or to reassert control over terrified populations. Others see it as a true, collective psychological breakdown fueled by trauma, isolation, and the power of suggestion. Was it primarily bottom-up village panic, or did authorities sometimes tacitly or actively endorse it? The motivations behind individual exhumations remain complex and debated. Fear was the engine, but who stoked the fire? You see the fear mutate into something darker, suspicion turning inward. Whispers start about the living, old widow Hannah, who lives alone with her cats and knows too many herbs. Maybe she consorts with the undead. The quiet miller's son, who keeps to himself. Perhaps he is a vampire's daytime servant. The fear of the dead transforms into a fear of the living who seem different, other. The communal bonds forged in hardship fray further, replaced by a corrosive paranoia. The vampire isn't just a monster in the graveyard anymore, it's a concept poisoning the well of community itself. The violence done to corpses becomes a grim social ritual, a desperate attempt to purge the invisible evil they believe is lurking everywhere. And just when the panic seems like it can't get any more pervasive, a new element arrives: officialdom. Word of these mass exhumations, these public stakings and decapitations, starts filtering up not just through peddlers' tales, but through reports from low-level officials, garrison commanders, bewildered priests writing to their bishops. The stories sound too outlandish, too medieval, for the age of reason. But they keep coming. From Serbia, from Hungary, from Transylvania. Reports pile up in provincial offices, then find their way to the grander desks in Vienna, capital of the Habsburg Empire. Eyebrows are raised. Sniffy letters are drafted. Disbelief wars with the sheer volume of testimony. Someone, somewhere in the labyrinthine imperial bureaucracy, decides this nonsense needs looking into. Properly. Scientifically. Or at least, officially. The villagers' desperate rituals are about to collide with the cold, rational gaze of the Enlightenment, and the collision is going to be anything but quiet. The panic isn't contained. It's reached the ears of power. And power, even skeptical power, demands a report. That collision happens not with the clash of swords, but with the dry, precise scratch of a quill pen on expensive paper. You feel the atmosphere shift drastically. Gone is the muddy graveyard, the smell of garlic and decay, the raw terror of the village. You're transported hundreds of miles northwest, into the heart of an empire trying very hard to be rational. Welcome to Vienna. Circa 1731 or 1732. The air here smells different: dust, beeswax, polish, expensive perfume trying to mask less pleasant odors, and the faint tang of ink and sealing wax. You're standing, perhaps invisibly, in a high-ceilinged office within the sprawling complex of imperial bureaucracy. Sunlight streams through tall windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing above meticulously organized desks. Men in powdered wigs and fine coats move with purpose, their expressions cultivated towards detached efficiency. This is the nerve center of the Habsburg monarchy, a place where Enlightenment ideals, reason, order, scientific inquiry are supposed to hold sway. And onto the polished desk of a likely bewildered, probably titled, imperial provisor, a kind of high-ranking administrator or military governor, lands a report. Not just any report. It's thick, detailed, and comes from a place that feels a world away, the military frontier zone of Serbia, specifically the village of Medvedja. The sender imperial officials on the ground, likely a military surgeon and a local commissioner named Frombold, tasked with investigating the escalating chaos. They weren't anthropologists, they were bureaucrats and medics sent to quell a disturbance. What they documented, however, was pure, uncut nightmare fuel, rendered in the dry, formal language of imperial administration. Mainstream history nudge, the visum et repertum Latin for seen and found concerning the Medvedja vampire case, often dated to 1731 to 1732, is one of the most famous historical documents of the panic. It wasn't unique, but its level of detail and its journey to the highest levels of Habsburg administration made it pivotal. It detailed the exhumation and treatment of multiple suspected vampires like Petr Blagojevic and Milo Ir following local complaints of deaths attributed to their nocturnal visits. This report, written by educated men, a surgeon, lent an air of official credibility to the phenomenon, however unintentionally. You watch as the provisor, perhaps sipping lukewarm coffee, picks up the report. His initial expression might be one of weary annoyance, another frontier squabble. But as he reads, his brow furrows. His lips purse. He might adjust his wig, a nervous habit. The words leap off the page, stark and bizarre against the backdrop of Viennese rationality. The body of Petr Blagojevic, found complete and undecomposed. Fresh blood in the mouth and nose. Skin and nails grown. A new skin under the old. The body of Milo Ir, similarly undecomposed. Flexible limbs, blood flowing fresh when pierced. Following the complaints of the inhabitants and according to local custom, the bodies were pierced through the heart with a sharp stake. Decapitated. Burned and the ashes cast into the river Morava. The dry tone makes it more unsettling. This isn't a peasant's rant scrawled on dirty parchment. This is a systematic account, witnessed and signed by imperial representatives. It describes bloated corpses, fresh blood, post-mortem hair and nail growth, and the prescribed ritual violence: staking, decapitation, burning with the clinical detachment of an inventory list. The sheer matter-of-factness of the horror is what hits hardest. It's not screaming vampire. It's calmly documenting observed phenomena and actions taken per local request. Weird little nugget, the report writers, trying to be scientifically objective within their 18th century understanding, documented things like the corpse's pliability and the blood that flowed when pierced. What they were likely describing was the normal state of a body in the bloat stage of decomposition, making it flexible, and the dark, decomposing fluid forced out under gas pressure when the body was punctured. Their medical training, while advanced for the time, lacked the specific forensic pathology to correctly interpret these signs. Their objective observations became unintentional fuel for the supernatural interpretation. The provisor finishes reading. He stares out the window at the orderly streets of Vienna, but he's seeing mud, stakes, and headless corpses burning by a riverbank. A profound cognitive dissonance sets in. This happening within the borders of the empire in the 18th century, he might scoff initially, dismiss it as frontier superstition amplified by ignorant officials. But the signatures are there. The details are specific, gruesome, and demand attention. He can't just file it away. This needs to go higher. Much higher. Perhaps even the imperial court. And so, the report begins its ascent. Copies are made. Summaries are drafted. It travels from desk to desk, each reader reacting with a similar mixture of disbelief, morbid fascination, and bureaucratic unease. It reaches advisors to the emperor himself, Charles VI. Imagine the scene in a gilded chamber, a minister, clearing his throat, presenting this bizarre dispatch from the wild edges of the realm. The reaction isn't recorded, but you can picture the raised eyebrows, the exchanged glances, the uncomfortable shifting in silk-upholstered chairs. Vampires in our empire. It sounds like something from the barbaric past, not the age of Newton and Voltaire. Yet, the report is official. It is detailed. It comes from their own men. Denial feels increasingly difficult. The sheer, unsettling weirdness of it punctures the Enlightenment bubble of Vienna's elite. Scholars still debate, how much did reports like the Visum et Repertum actually spread the panic versus merely documenting it? Did their circulation among officials inadvertently validate the phenomenon by treating it as a serious administrative issue, or did their very existence, by bringing the barbarity to light, ultimately fuel the rationalist backlash against such practices? The document sits at a fascinating crossroads, a product of superstition, filtered through bureaucratic objectivity, landing on the desks of Enlightenment skepticism. Its journey is as significant as its content. You feel the shockwaves emanating from that report. It's no longer just a village horror story. It's an imperial matter. A problem. The rational center of the Habsburg world has been confronted with something profoundly irrational occurring within its own borders. The reaction isn't unified. Some dismiss it utterly. Others are morbidly fascinated. A few, perhaps more pragmatic or concerned about public order, realize something must be done. But what sends soldiers to stop peasants staking corpses that could spark rebellion? Ignore it, risk the panic spreading further, or send someone else, someone with medical training, perhaps, to look at this with truly scientific eyes, to dissect the hysteria. If not the corpses themselves, the idea takes root. If superstition created this monster, perhaps science could slay it. Orders are drafted. A new expedition is planned. Not just bureaucrats this time. Doctors. Men of learning. They are to go to the source, to Medvedgia or places like it, and investigate these vampires not as monsters, but as medical anomalies. The Age of Reason is sending its emissaries into the heart of darkness, armed not with stakes, but with scalpels and notebooks. The vampire panic is about to undergo a very uncomfortable physical examination. The emissaries of reason arrive, not with the grim resolve of villagers clutching stakes, but with the brisk efficiency of men on an unpleasant assignment. You're back in the frontier mud, but the atmosphere is drastically different this time. Imperial authority hangs heavy in the damp air. A detachment of Habsburg soldiers stands at uneasy attention, their uniforms a splash of disciplined color against the drab village and the ominous backdrop of the graveyard. Their presence isn't just for show, it's a reminder that this chaotic peasant ritual is now under imperial scrutiny. And at the center of it all, the doctors. Picture them. Likely 2 or 3 men dispatched from a provincial garrison or a larger town. They wear coats that were fine in Vienna but look absurdly out of place here, already dusted with travel grime. Their wigs might be slightly askew. They carry leather bags containing the tools of their trade, scalpels, probes, notebooks, inkwells, perhaps a magnifying glass. They project an air of studied detachment, a shield against the palpable fear and superstition radiating from the villagers clustered at a wary distance. These men represent the cutting-edge, pun slightly intended, of 18th century medical science. They come not to perform an exorcism, but an autopsy. Not to confirm a vampire, but to explain a corpse. Mainstream history nudge, these official medical investigations, often ordered directly in response to reports like the Visum et Repertum, were a hallmark of the Habsburg response to the vampire panic. Figures like Imperial Regimental Field Surgeon Johannes Flickering, who authored or contributed to several key reports, became pivotal. Their task was paradoxical: use emerging scientific methods to debunk supernatural claims, but within a cultural context where those claims were deeply held and the evidence, the corpse's condition, seemed at first glance, bizarrely supportive. They walked a tightrope between reason and local hysteria. The scene is set with bureaucratic precision. The grave in question, perhaps Petr Blagojevic's from the report, or another newly accused, is indicated. The villagers watch, silent and wide-eyed, crossing themselves constantly. To them, the doctors are almost as alien as the vampire itself. The diggers, perhaps the same men who exhumed Maludin weeks or months ago, are ordered to work again. The rhythmic thunk-thunk of shovels feels slower, more deliberate, under the doctor's watchful gaze. The coffin is exposed, pried open. The smell hits that now familiar, cloying stench of advanced decomposition. You see one of the doctors subtly raise a scented handkerchief to his nose, his expression tightening but remaining professionally neutral. The other leans closer, peering intently as the bloated, discolored corpse is hauled out onto a canvas sheet laid on the ground. This is where the Enlightenment meets the grave. The doctors don't gasp or recoil in superstitious horror. They observe, they take notes. They confer in low, clinical tones. One kneels beside the body, ignoring the mud staining his knees. He probes the swollen abdomen with gloved fingers, feeling the tautness. He examines the face, the dark fluid crusted around the nose and mouth. He checks the fingernails. He might lift an arm, noting the surprising lack of rigor mortis, the unsettling flexibility. To the villagers, these actions seem sacrilegious, dangerous. To the doctors, they're data points. Observe the distension, one doctor murmurs to the other, perhaps to the accompanying officer acting as scribe. Consistent with gaseous accumulation within the abdominal cavity. Common in rapid decomposition, especially in warmer months or following febrile illness. He points to the dark seepage. This exudate, dark, viscous. Not arterial blood. Likely purulent fluid mixed with decomposed blood serum, forced out by internal pressure. He might use a probe to gently collect a sample, holding it up. Note the color. The consistency. Inconsistent with fresh sanguineous fluid. He examines the skin. Apparent growth of nails and hair. He gently lifts a section of skin near the wrist. Ah! See here epidermal detachment. The underlying dermis, being moister, can create the illusion of new skin or growth beneath. The nails appear longer because the surrounding skin has retracted as it dries and shrinks. He looks towards the villagers. Perfectly natural processes. Misinterpreted. Weird little nugget. Doctors performing these examinations sometimes noted the corpse felt warm to the touch in spots, especially deep in the torso. This wasn't supernatural vitality. It was the heat generated by intense bacterial activity during decomposition. Imagine the cognitive dissonance for the villagers. The learned doctor pokes the vampire and calmly explains its belly is warm because of tiny, invisible creatures eating it from the inside out. Which explanation sounded more fantastical in that moment? The dissection might go further. A scalpel glints in the gray light. A careful incision is made, perhaps into the abdomen. There's a distinct, audible hiss as pent-up gases escape, a sound that makes the soldiers shift uneasily and the villagers mutter prayers. The doctors ignore it. They examine the internal organs: liver, stomach, intestines, noting the advanced putrefaction, the dark, liquefying masses. They might look specifically at the heart. No unusual activity, one states flatly. Muscle tissue severely degraded. No evidence of recent consumption. The sarcasm is subtle but present. They search for any sign of the corpse having ingested blood or any abnormality that could explain the folk beliefs. They find none. Only the messy, undeniable, profoundly biological reality of decay. Scholars still debate How much did these medical reports actually change minds on the ground? The doctors wrote clear, rational explanations: bloating from gases, fluid seepage, skin slippage mimicking growth, rapid decomposition due to disease or environment. Their conclusions were unequivocal: natural causes, no vampirism. Yet, the panic often continued locally. Was it the sheer visceral horror of the corpse overriding rational explanation, deep-seated cultural beliefs, or simply that the doctors left after writing their report, leaving the terrified villagers alone again with their graveyards and nightmares? The gap between scientific explanation and deeply held cultural fear proved frustratingly wide. As the doctors clean their instruments and pack their bags, the villagers watch, their expressions a mixture of fear, resentment, and profound confusion. The imperial officers look relieved: they have their scientific answer to send back to Vienna. The doctors feel a sense of professional satisfaction: they've dissected the superstition and found only biology. But you, standing there in the mud, feel the unresolved tension thick in the air. The doctors spoke of gases and bacteria and skin slippage. The villagers saw a bloated monster leaking blood that threatened their families. The doctors offered cold reason. The villagers lived with hot, primal fear. The autopsy report, destined for an imperial desk, would declare the matter settled by science. But in the hearts of those who buried their dead in this soil, the chill of the grave felt no less real. Science had explained the how, but it hadn't touched the why of their terror, the deep-seated dread of the dead walking. As the doctor's carriage rolls away, escorted by soldiers, the villagers turn back to their graveyard. The fear hasn't been exorcised. It's merely been documented. And the whispers about the next suspicious death are already starting. Science had its say, but the night, and the fear it held, was far from over. The roots of the panic went deeper than any scalpel could reach, tangled in stories told for generations in the flickering firelight of long, dark winters. What were those stories? It was time to listen in the shadows. The doctor's carriage rattles away, carrying their rational explanations back to Vienna. The soldiers march off, their boots echoing a fading reminder of imperial authority. You're left standing in the village square as dusk bleeds into a deep, velvety night. The air, thick with the lingering damp and wood smoke, feels charged again, but differently now. The official scrutiny is gone, replaced by the familiar, intimate darkness, and with it, the whispers return. Louder. More urgent. The doctors spoke of gases and bacteria, words that feel alien, meaningless against the visceral memory of the bloated corpse and the suffocating fear that clings like cobwebs. Science dissected the body, but it didn't touch the story. The story that lives in the shadows, passed from grandmother to grandchild, murmured over flickering hearths during long, isolating winters. Tonight, you're invited to one of those hearths. You slip into a low, smoky hut, crowded with neighbors. The firelight dances on anxious faces. Old man Stefan, whose hands are gnarled like tree roots and whose eyes hold the weight of countless winters, clears his throat. The room falls silent, expectant. This is where the real understanding lies, not in scalpels and reports, but in the shared breath of generations facing the unimaginable. He doesn't talk about bacteria. He talks about Noxerer. Mainstream history nudge. The concept of the Noxerer German, roughly after devourer or shroud eater, was a widespread folk belief in Germanic and Slavic regions, predating the 18th century panic but absolutely central to it. Unlike the later, more aristocratic vampire of fiction, the Noxerer was a profoundly intimate horror. It was believed that certain individuals, often those who died suddenly, violently, or with unfinished business like suicides, unbaptized babies, or the first victim of a plague, could rise not just to drink blood, but to consume their own burial shroud, their own flesh, and ultimately, the life force of their surviving family and livestock. It was a parasite feeding from beyond the grave, starting with those it loved most. Stefan's voice is low, gravelly, weaving the familiar terror. "You see," he murmurs, leaning closer to the fire, casting long, dancing shadows, "it's not just about blood, like those fancy city folk might think. No. It's deeper. Darker. When a soul passes, unsettled, angry, cheated, sometimes, the body doesn't rest. It gets hungry. Not for food. For life." He pauses, letting the word hang heavy in the smoky air. "It starts in the grave. You hear the chewing like rats that them. Eating their own shroud. Then, their own lips. Their tongue. Gnawing, always gnawing. The image is grotesque, visceral. And as they eat, down there in the dark." Stefan points a bony finger towards the floor, towards the earth. "Their kin up here." He gestures around the hut, making eye contact with each listener. "They waste. They sicken. The cow gives no milk, the child coughs blood. The Noxerer is sucking the life out of them, bite by bite, through the earth itself. Draining them dry. Like a leech you can't see, anchored in the grave." He leans back, the firelight catching the deep lines of fear and certainty on his face. That S.Y. Maludin looked full. Plump, even. He wasn't just walking, he was feasting. On Anna. On the sheep. On us. Weird little nugget, the Noxerer belief offered a bizarrely practical diagnostic tool. People listened at graves. Seriously. If you heard gnawing, crunching, or chewing sounds emanating from a fresh grave, sounds likely caused by settling earth, shifting coffin wood, or even burrowing animals, it was considered definitive proof of a shroud eater at work. Imagine the terror of pressing your ear to cold earth and hearing anything resembling mastication in the silence of the night. Confirmation bias had a field day. You sit there, the heat of the fire on your face contrasting sharply with the chill crawling up your spine. The doctor's explanations feel pale, distant. This makes a terrifying kind of sense within the world of the village. It explains the wasting sickness after the plague's main wave. The Noxerer victims were the delayed harvest. It explains why the dead targeted their own families first, the closest connection, the easiest life force to drain. It explains the bloating, the corpse was literally gorged on stolen vitality. The fear isn't abstract, it's deeply personal. It's the terror that the mother you buried last week isn't resting peacefully, she's trapped, ravenous, and slowly devouring your infant brother in his cradle through an invisible, unholy tether. It transforms grief into a horrifying betrayal. Death isn't an end, it's a transformation into something parasitic, intimate, and inescapable. The violence of staking, decapitating, burning, it's not just punishment, it's severing that connection. It's stopping the invisible feeding. It's protecting the living from the insatiable hunger of the loved one they mourned. Scholars still debate, was the Noxerer belief a cause of the vampire panic or a framework used to interpret it? Did this specific folkloric concept actively drive the exhumations, or was it simply the pre-existing cultural lens through which the trauma of plague and inexplicable deaths was understood and processed? Some argue the panic amplified and spread the Noxerer concept beyond its traditional regions. Others see it as the essential core without which the specific forms the panic took, targeting recently deceased kin. The focus on bloating as feeding wouldn't make sense. It's a chicken and egg debate steeped in folklore and trauma psychology. As the fire burns low and the stories wind down, you feel the weight of this belief settle over the hut like a shroud. It's more than superstition, it's a coping mechanism forged in the crucible of relentless, inexplicable suffering. When death is random, swift, and devastating, the mind craves agency, even malevolent agency. The Knox error provides it. It gives a reason for the waste, the lingering sickness, the livestock dying. It gives a target for the rage and grief that has nowhere else to go. And crucially, it gives a solution: find the feaster and stop it, violently. It transforms helplessness into action, however horrific that action may be. Leaving the hut, the village feels different. The shadows seem deeper, more purposeful. Every rustle in the thatch could be the scrape of unseen jaws. The silence isn't empty, it's listening. You understand now why the doctor's words fell on deaf ears. They explained the corpse. They didn't touch the story, the deep, ancestral terror of the hungry grave, the intimate betrayal of the dead consuming the living. That story is etched into the soul of this place, written in the lines of weary faces staring into the dying embers. It's a fear whispered from generation to generation, a dark inheritance passed down with the family name and the plot in the churchyard. But stories, especially terrifying ones, have a way of escaping their hearths. Like the plague itself, this intimate horror of the Knox error is about to mutate. It's shedding its local skin, losing its complex, culturally specific hunger, and transforming into something simpler, more sensational, more marketable. It's catching the attention of people who don't fear the gnawing in the grave, but are fascinated by the idea of it. People with printing presses and a public hungry for the next big, shocking story. The whispers of the frontier are about to become headlines in the heart of the Enlightenment. The village terror is going viral, 18th century style. Get ready for the dawn of the media vampire. The whispers don't just travel on peddlers' carts or soldiers' dispatches anymore. They're inked onto cheap, pulpy paper, stamped with the clatter of a printing press, and flung out into the bustling arteries of 18th century Europe. You feel the scene shift dramatically, violently almost. One moment, you're huddled in the smoky, fear-laden hut listening to tales of the Knox error, the next, you're jostled by the noise and stink of a Viennese coffee house. Or perhaps Leipzig. Or Paris. The air here is thick with competing aromas, rich coffee beans roasting, bitter chocolate steaming, expensive pipe tobacco, sweat, perfume, and the sharp, acrid tang of printer's ink. The sound is a cacophony: clinking cups, animated debate in half a dozen languages, the rustle of newspapers, the hawker's cry slicing through the din: extra! Extra! Read all about it. Grisly discoveries in the East. The undead terrorize imperial provinces. You find a cramped seat at a sticky table. Before you, someone has discarded a folded broadsheet. The ink is still slightly damp, smudging under your fingertips. The headline screams in bold, uneven type: horrors from Hungary, blood-drinking cadavers unearthed. Imperial surgeon's shocking testimony. Beneath it, often embellished with a crude woodcut depicting a bloated corpse with fangs, a detail notably absent from the original reports, is a lurid summary of the visum et repertum or similar accounts. The language is sensational, breathless, designed to shock and sell. Corpses found fresh as the day they died, filled with the blood of their victims. Wretches rise from the grave to suck the life from their own kin. Brave peasants forced to stake and decapitate the monsters. Doctors confirm the unnatural state. A gross oversimplification of the medical findings, conveniently omitting the natural processes explanation. Mainstream history nudge. The 18th century saw an explosion in newspapers and periodicals, especially in urban centers. Publications like the Wienerisches Diary Vienna, the London Journal, or Mercure de France Paris devoured sensational stories. The vampire reports from the Habsburg frontier were perfect fodder, exotic, terrifying, vaguely scientific thanks to the official documents, and satisfyingly gruesome. They weren't reporting local folklore, they were repackaging imperial documents and travelers' tales into lurid, mass-market horror stories. The vampire panic became one of the first true media frenzies. You watch the patrons. Reactions are varied, a world away from the visceral terror of the Serbian village. A group of young dandies near the window pore over the story, exclaiming with a mix of horrified delight and morbid fascination. Imagine, Henri. Corpses supping on the living. Ghastly. Simply ghastly. Pass the sugar. A merchant frowns, scanning the article for mentions of trade routes disrupted by monster hunts. A stern-looking cleric reads with deepening disapproval, muttering about superstition and the devil's work. A woman in a fine silk dress shudders dramatically, fanning herself, perhaps genuinely unsettled, perhaps enjoying the thrill. The vampire has been abstracted, commodified. It's no longer a specific horror haunting grieving families, it's a spectacle. A topic for debate over expensive coffee. A thrilling shiver down the spine before returning to the comforts of city life. The Nachzier's intimate, familial horror is lost, replaced by a more generalized, gothic bogeyman, the vampire. Weird little nugget, this media frenzy spawned some truly bizarre entrepreneurial ventures. Alongside the newspapers, opportunistic publishers flooded the market with cheap pamphlets and true accounts often wildly fictionalized. Even more strangely, advertisements began appearing for vampire-proof items, amulets blessed by distant and dubious priests, specially formulated anti-vampire garlic pastilles, even instructions for constructing secure coffins with bells to alert the living if the occupant tried to get out. Fear, once localized, had become a marketable commodity across Europe. The coffee house buzzes with debate. It's the 1730s, the heart of the Enlightenment. Reason is king, but kings also enjoy a good ghost story. Arguments fly, preposterous superstition. The credulity of peasants exploited by charlatans. Scoffs a man who looks like a scholar. But the imperial reports. Signed by surgeons. Can all those witnesses be wrong? Counters another, tapping the smudged newsprint. Perhaps it is a new disease, a contagion that mimics death then revives the sufferer with unholy appetites, muses a third, trying to bridge reason and sensation. It is divine punishment. Or the devil's literal harvest. The cleric intones, drawing nods from some, eye rolls from others. Or perhaps, drawls a voice dripping with sarcasm from a corner table, it is merely the logical consequence of burying people alive, which, given the state of provincial medicine, is distressingly probable. This last voice belongs to a sharp-eyed man nursing a cup of chocolate. He might be a writer, a philosopher. He's voicing the emerging rationalist counter-narrative, but even he can't resist the topic's dark allure. The vampire has escaped the graveyard. It's loose in the salons, the lecture halls, the pages of philosophical treatises and popular magazines. It becomes the ultimate conversation starter, the bizarre counterpoint to discussions of Newtonian physics and constitutional government. It's exotic, thrilling proof of the barbarism lingering on the edges of civilized Europe, or alternatively, a baffling anomaly challenging the supremacy of reason. Everyone has an opinion. Everyone is talking about it. The panic isn't just spreading geographically anymore, it's metastasizing intellectually and culturally. The vampire becomes a symbol of superstition, of irrationality, of the unknown, of the dark underbelly of the Age of Light. Scholars still debate, how instrumental was this media frenzy in sustaining the panic? Did the constant stream of sensational reports pouring out of Eastern Europe actually reinforce peasant beliefs by making the phenomenon seem widespread and officially acknowledged, or did the very act of discussing it rationally in coffee houses and pamphlets ultimately help demystify and discredit it? Was the media a vector for the disease of fear, or the beginning of its cure through exposure and debate. The lines between reporting, sensationalism, and cultural impact were blurry then, just as they are now. You finish your coffee, it tastes faintly of ink, leaving the animated debate behind. As you step out into the bustling street, the cries of the news hawkers still echo, "Vampires! Read the latest." The story feels different here. Less like a chilling campfire tale, more like a fascinating, grotesque puzzle. But the puzzle has caught the attention of the brightest minds of the age. Men who wielded pens sharper than any stake. Men like Voltaire. And he, you sense, is about to skewer the whole bloody affair with the most devastating weapon of the Enlightenment, ridicule. The vampire's next confrontation isn't with a peasant's sickle, but with a philosopher's wit. And wit, in the right hands, could be far more lethal. That cup of slightly inky coffee you left cooling on the Viennese cafe table, forget it. You've been teleported via the sheer gravitational pull of wit and outrage to a very different kind of room. The air here is still thick, but with the scent of old paper, sealing wax, expensive snuff, and, is that, chocolate. Welcome to the inner sanctum of François-Marie Arouet, known to history and everyone who mattered as Voltaire. Picture him, probably not in a powdered wig at this moment, maybe wearing a comfortable, slightly worn dressing gown, perched at a writing desk buried under an avalanche of books, pamphlets, letters, and scribbled notes. His eyes are sharp, intelligent, and currently sparkling with a mixture of profound irritation and malicious glee. On the desk, amidst the chaos, lies a copy of one of those lurid vampire broadsheets, its sensational headline almost comical against the backdrop of his serious work. He picks it up between thumb and forefinger, like it's a slightly soiled handkerchief someone dropped on his floor. "Increased-oyable," he mutters, his voice dry as old parchment. Truly, the depths of human absurdity never cease to amaze. He lets the word hang, dripping with sarcasm. He's not horrified like the villagers. He's not morbidly fascinated like the coffeehouse patrons. He's incensed. This isn't just superstition, it's an affront to everything he and his fellow philosophes are fighting for: reason, progress, the banishment of medieval darkness by the clear light of intellect. And worse, it's happening now, in the supposed age of enlightenment, fueled by official reports. This requires not just rebuttal, but demolition. With extreme prejudice. And Voltaire has just the tools, a rapier-sharp pen and a bottomless well of scorn. Mainstream history nudge, Voltaire was arguably the Enlightenment's most famous and influential, and certainly its most acerbic voice. He tackled religious dogma, political tyranny, and social injustice with ferocious wit. The vampire panic, erupting in the 1730s, became a prime target. He saw it as the perfect embodiment of the ignorance, superstition, and credulity he dedicated his life to combating. It wasn't a niche interest, it was Exhibit A in the case against unreason. His writings on the subject, particularly in his Dictionnaire philosophique philosophical dictionary under the entry Vampires, are master classes in devastating satire and rationalist argument. He dips his quill into the inkwell, a predatory smile playing on his lips. He doesn't just write, he skewers. What? Is it in our 18th century that vampires exist? Is it after the reigns of Locke, Shaftesbury, Trenchard, and Collins? Is it under those of Diderot, d'Alembert, and Duclos that we believe in vampires? The outrage is palpable. How dare such barbarism persist in the era of Newton and rational inquiry? He eviscerates the evidence. These vampires were corpses who went out of their graves at night to suck the blood of the living, either at their throats or stomachs, after which they returned to the cemetery. The persons so sucked waned, grew pale, and fell into consumption, while the sucking corpses grew fat, got rosy, and enjoyed an excellent appetite. He renders the belief itself ridiculous simply by stating it plainly, highlighting its inherent absurdity. He then turns his firepower on the official reports. The whole affair is certified, signed by a major, by 2 ensigns, by the surgeon major of the regiment, and by the principal inhabitants of the place. His tone drips with mock reverence. Certified. By military men. By surgeons. By inhabitants. As if rank or numbers could validate utter nonsense. He dissects their observations: the bloating, the fresh blood, the flexibility not with a scalpel, but with the cold logic of physics and biology. Decomposition gases. Settling fluids. Natural processes grotesquely misinterpreted by frightened simpletons and, worse, inadequately trained officials lending it credence. They saw, therefore, a very natural thing with the eyes of credulity. Weird little nugget, Voltaire, ever the pragmatist and skeptic, offered a much more earthly explanation for the vampire corpses: premature burial. Given the state of 18th century medicine, declaring death wasn't always precise. People could lapse into deep comas or catalepsy, be declared dead, and buried alive. Waking up underground in a panic, struggling, thrashing, biting their own tongues and lips in terror, perhaps causing the blood seen later, suffocating. This, Voltaire argued, was the real horror. The vampire wasn't supernatural, it was a tragically misdiagnosed living person subjected to unimaginable torment. His alternative was arguably more horrifying than the myth, but firmly grounded in plausible reality. It was his Occam's razor applied to the undead. He doesn't stop at the reports. He broadens his attack to encompass the entire structure of belief that allows such panics to flourish. He links it to religious dogma, to the manipulation of the masses by authorities both church and state, to the stubborn refusal to embrace scientific understanding. When the Holy Fathers of antiquity spoke of resurrections, they meant souls, not bodies. But our modern barbarians believe in the resurrection of bodies without souls, and these bodies are more malignant than they were before. For Voltaire, the vampire panic wasn't an isolated incident, it was a symptom of the pervasive sickness of unreason that infected society, a sickness he was determined to cure with the purgative of ridicule and logic. His weapon wasn't a stake, it was laughter aimed at the heart of superstition itself. Scholars still debate, how effective was Voltaire's scathing critique? Did his ridicule actually help end the vampire panic in the villages? Probably not directly. Peasants in Serbian hamlets weren't reading the Dictionnaire philosophique. However, his writings were immensely influential among the educated elites, intellectuals, and policymakers across Europe. He helped solidify the rationalist narrative, turning vampire into shorthand for backwardness, superstition, and anti-Enlightenment thinking. His work contributed significantly to framing the panic as an embarrassing relic of the past, something for civilized society to reject and move beyond. He didn't stop the digging overnight, but he helped ensure the intellectual high ground belonged firmly to skepticism. You watch him send the page, a satisfied smirk on his face. He's taken the bloated, terrifying specter of the vampire and punctured it with logic, letting out not blood, but the hot air of superstition. He's reduced it to an object of derision, a joke in poor taste played by fear and ignorance on the credulous. For Voltaire, the battle is clear: light versus darkness, reason versus superstition. And on this particular front, he feels he's scored a decisive victory for the forces of light. He rings a small bell. More chocolate, he commands, the vampire broadsheet now relegated to the pile of papers destined to line the birdcage or light the fire. Case closed. For him. But as you step back from the electric atmosphere of his study, a different kind of tension hangs in the air. Voltaire's logic is brilliant, his scorn withering. Yet, It feels distant, cerebral. He dissected the phenomenon like a specimen, dismissing the profound, gut-wrenching fear that drove it as mere stupidity. He offered a rational explanation for the corpses, even a horrifyingly plausible one: premature burial, but he didn't engage with the deep cultural wellsprings of terror, the Noxerer myth, the intimate horror of the dead consuming the living. For the villagers, the terror wasn't abstract, it was about protecting their children from their own grandmothers. For the church, wrestling with its own doctrines and the authority of Scripture, the vampire panic presented a different kind of puzzle, one that couldn't be solved by mockery or medical textbooks alone. Voltaire had his say, brilliantly, devastatingly. But the echoes of the stake hammering into Milutin's chest, the whispers in the graveyard, the profound questions about death, the soul, and divine or infernal power, those echoes were now reverberating in the vaulted halls of theology. The philosophers had scoffed. Now, it was the theologians' turn to wrestle with the undead. The battle for the soul of the vampire was moving from the coffeehouse and the philosopher's study to the pulpit and the synod. The age of faith wasn't done with the age of monsters yet. Voltaire's laughter echoes in the halls of philosophy, sharp and dismissive. But step across the threshold into the grand, echoing chambers of theology, perhaps a bishop's palace, a seminary library smelling of old vellum and incense, or a tense gathering of clerics in a provincial chapter house, and the atmosphere is thick with a different kind of tension. Not the gleeful scorn of the rationalist, but the profound, deeply uncomfortable anxiety of men whose entire worldview is being rattled by reports from the muddy frontier. Here, Voltaire's chocolate and wit feel like distant indulgences. Here, the vampire panic isn't a joke, it's a theological crisis. You sit, perhaps unseen, in a dimly lit chamber. Heavy velvet drapes partially block the light. The faces around the long oak table are grave, edged with worry lines deeper than those of Voltaire's amusement. These are learned men, bishops, abbots, theologians, men steeped in scripture, canon law, and centuries of doctrinal debate. Before them lie copies of the same reports that fueled the coffeehouse debates and Voltaire's ire, the visum et repertum, accounts from parish priests in affected regions, desperate pleas for guidance. The air hums not with mockery, but with a profound sense of unease. How does the one true church reconcile the existence of this mainstream history nudge? The vampire panic presented the Christian Church, both Catholic and Protestant denominations, with a profound theological and practical challenge. Core Christian doctrine centered on the resurrection of the body and the finality of death until Judgment Day. The idea of corpses physically rising before the resurrection to prey on the living was deeply heretical. It smacked of pagan animism, demonic possession, or worse, a fundamental flaw in the divine plan. Church authorities were caught between dismissing peasant superstition, as Voltaire urged, and addressing the sheer volume of terrifying, seemingly credible reports flooding in, often from their own parish priests on the ground. Their response was often conflicted and varied. The debate is hushed, intense. One elderly bishop, fingers trembling slightly on the polished wood, voices the core dilemma: brothers, we must not, give credence to these pagan fantasies of walking corpses. The soul departs the body at death. The body returns to dust, awaiting the resurrection. To suggest otherwise is to deny the very core of our faith. He slams a fist down softly for emphasis. This is mass hysteria, fueled by plague and ignorance. Demonic deception, perhaps, manifesting as these horrors to lead the simple astray. A younger abbot, his face pale but determined, leans forward. With all respect, Your Grace, we have sworn testimony from good priests, God-fearing men. They describe phenomena. Corpses bloated, supple, leaking fluid, signs the peasants interpret as activity. And the deaths. Whole families wasting after burial. Can we simply dismiss the suffering of our flock as mere ignorance? What if it is demonic, but demons acting through the corpse or mimicking the dead? The possibilities are theologically treacherous. If demons can perfectly imitate beloved grandmothers to drain the life from grandchildren, where does that leave trust, grief, or the sanctity of the grave? A third voice, calmer, more scholarly, we must consult Scripture. Where is the precedent? Lazarus was raised by Christ, not by his own malevolence. The witch of Endor summoned the spirit of Samuel, not his rotting body. The book of Revelation speaks of plagues and demons, but not this. This concept of the corporeal, blood-drinking revenant, it finds no footing in Holy Writ. This is a crucial point. The vampire, as described, had no clear biblical pedigree. It felt like an import from the dark forests of paganism, not the deserts of Sinai. Weird little nugget. Some theologians, grappling for an explanation within orthodoxy, floated the idea of revenants by divine permission. Essentially, God allowed certain souls, perhaps those who died in mortal sin, excommunicated, or unbaptized, to be temporarily sent back in their bodies as a warning or punishment, or as agents of divine wrath. This was a theological tightrope walk, acknowledging the phenomenon without attributing true agency or life to the corpse itself, which remained God's vessel. It was an attempt to fit a square, blood-drenched peg into a round, doctrinal hole. The arguments circle, frustrated. Dismissing it entirely risks alienating terrified congregations and appearing callous. Endorsing the vampire concept is theologically impossible. Blaming demons is tempting, but raises thorny questions about God's permission and the vulnerability of the dead. Some hardliners argue for excommunicating peasants who participate in stakings and desecrations. Others counter that this would only drive them further into fear and superstition. Practical priests in the afflicted regions write desperate letters. What do I tell my people? Do I forbid them from protecting themselves as they see fit? Do I perform an exorcism on a corpse? There are no clear answers in the Summa Theologica for this. Scholars still debate. How did the Church's varied and often conflicted response impact the panic? Did official condemnation from some bishops actually deter exhumations, or did it simply drive the practices further underground, making them harder to monitor? Did the attempts to find theological explanations like divine permission inadvertently lend a kind of religious legitimacy to the core fear, or did the Church's ultimate inability to provide a satisfying answer within its own framework create a vacuum eventually filled by rationalist medicine? The Church was a powerful social and cultural force. Its struggle to respond effectively highlights the panic's deep challenge to established institutions. You feel the weight of their impotence. These men wield spiritual authority, but against the raw, visceral terror of the Knox error and the baffling physical evidence in the graves, their learned arguments feel abstract, insufficient. The bishop sighs, rubbing his temples. Perhaps we must emphasize pastoral care. Comfort the afflicted. Remind them of Christ's victory over death. Urge them to trust in God's protection, not sharpened stakes. It's a worthy sentiment, but it rings hollow against the image of a mother watching her child sicken, convinced the corpse of her husband is draining its life from the churchyard. Faith is powerful, but fear is primal. The meeting adjourns without clear resolution. Edicts might be drafted, cautioning against superstition and the desecration of graves, perhaps reiterating the finality of Christian death. But the underlying theological knots remain tangled. The Church, guardian of the soul's eternal fate, finds itself powerless against the folkloric terror of the walking corpse. Its weapons, prayer, scripture, doctrine, seem ill-suited to combat a threat rooted in the earth, in decomposition, in the intimate dread of the grave refusing to hold its occupant. As the clerics disperse, their robes whispering against the stone floors, a different kind of figure watches from the metaphorical and perhaps literal shadows. He smells opportunity. Not in the lofty realms of theology or philosophy, but in the fertile ground of fear itself. He sees the confusion of the priests, the desperation of the villagers, the gaping void of certainty. He doesn't have a degree from a university or ordination from a bishop. What he has is confidence, a glib tongue, and a bag of tricks. He's been listening to the whispers, reading the lurid pamphlets, noting the church's struggle. He knows what the people want, not complex doctrine, not scientific explanations, but assurance. A definitive solution. Someone who understands the monster and knows how to slay it. For a price. The vampire panic has created a market. And he's ready to sell the cure. The era of the professional vampire hunter is dawning, armed with charlatanry and a keen eye for profit. Theology's loss is about to become a huckster's gain. The heavy oak doors of the theological conclave close behind the troubled clerics. The scent of incense and old parchment fades, replaced by the sharper tang of wood smoke, damp wool, and, is that cheap lavender water mixed with something vaguely metallic. You find yourself not in a palace or seminary, but back on the rutted, muddy road leading towards another village gripped by the familiar, suffocating dread. But this time, there's a new figure on the scene, and he cuts a deliberately conspicuous silhouette against the grey landscape. Meet Grigor. Or maybe Stephanos. Or Herr Dr. Nachtigall. His name changes depending on the audience and the proximity of the last town. He arrives not on foot like a weary traveler, but perhaps on a sturdy, if slightly sway-backed, horse, or in a modest cart pulled by a disinterested donkey. His clothes are a carefully curated blend of the exotic and the authoritative, a long, dark coat that might pass for scholarly if it weren't slightly threadbare at the cuffs, boots polished to a deceptive shine, perhaps a wide-brimmed hat shadowing intense, piercing eyes that seem to miss nothing. He carries a large, worn leather satchel that looks reassuringly weighty with knowledge and tools. Definitely tools. He doesn't head for the inn. He heads straight for the village elders or the most visibly terrified household. He doesn't wait for an invitation, he announces himself. His voice is deep, resonant, projecting confidence like a shield. Good people, he intones, sweeping his gaze across the anxious faces that cautiously gather. I have traveled far. I have heard the whispers carried on the wind. Whispers of darkness. Whispers of the unquiet dead. He lets the phrase hang, heavy with implication. He sees the flinch, the flicker of recognition in their eyes. Fear is his currency, and he's a master manipulator of the exchange rate. I am Grigor, he declares, perhaps thumping his chest lightly. A humble servant of the light. A specialist in disturbances of the grave. I understand what plagues you. I have seen its like before. In Buda. In Klausenberg. Even in the shadow of the Carpathians. He drops names like talismans, places synonymous with the panic. His authority is self-proclaimed, but delivered with such conviction it momentarily silences doubt. Mainstream history nudge. The vampire panic created fertile ground for charlatans and opportunists. Figures like Grigor emerged, often traveling experts claiming unique knowledge of the undead. They exploited the vacuum left by the church's theological confusion and the slow pace of medical enlightenment reaching rural areas. They blended scraps of folklore, misunderstood science sometimes referencing the official reports, religious jargon, and pure theater to present themselves as the only solution. They preyed on desperation, offering certainty for a price. You watch his performance unfold. He listens gravely to the villagers' tales, the wasting sickness, the nightmares, the suspicious death buried last month. He nods sagely, stroking a beard that might be suspiciously well trimmed for a man who supposedly battles the undead in remote graveyards. "Ah, yes," he murmurs. "The signs are unmistakable. The Noxerer. Or perhaps the Vrikolakis. A powerful one. Its malice seeps through the very earth." He diagnoses the type of vampire with an air of profound expertise, making the terror feel categorized, and therefore, somehow more manageable. "But fear not," he booms, suddenly radiating confidence. "I possess the knowledge. The sacred methods. Passed down through generations, augmented by my own, rigorous studies." He pats his satchel meaningfully. Then comes the pitch. He opens the satchel, revealing an array of items designed to awe and intimidate: vials of murky liquid labeled consecrated earth water or essence of mountain thyme anti-phantom. Bundles of pungent herbs, mostly garlic and common weeds, artfully arranged. Crudely forged iron amulets etched with esoteric symbols that look vaguely Byzantine or just made up. Perhaps a small, tarnished silver cross bought cheaply from a pawnbroker. A well-worn mallet and a stake that looks suspiciously like a repurposed tent peg. A heavy, leather-bound grimoire filled with pages of cryptic symbols and dramatic illustrations likely drawn by Grigor himself after too much cheap wine. "Protection," he announces, holding up an amulet. "Worn day and night. Repels the subtle emanations." He jingles a vial. "Purification. Sprinkle around thresholds, beds, the grave itself, naturally." He picks up the stake and mallet. "And for the source, the final severance. But this," he adds, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "is delicate work. Dangerous. Requiring precise timing, sacred incantations known only to the initiated, and considerable resources to procure the necessary blessed materials." He lets the implication hang. This expertise doesn't come cheap. Weird little nugget, these professional vampire hunters often offered tiered services, like a macabre subscription package, the basic ward, amulet and vial of holy water. Affordable. Peace of mind for the masses. The home protection bundle, amulet, multiple vials, blessed herbs for every window door, instructions for nightly prayers. For the moderately terrified and reasonably prosperous. The full exorcism and neutralization deluxe, personal consultation, graveyard survey, the exhumation ritual stake, decapitation, garlic, maybe a quick exorcism chant Grigor made up on the spot, and a lifetime guarantee amulet valid until the next suspicious death. Extremely expensive, reserved for the deeply panicked village elders pooling their resources. He quotes prices that make the elders blanch. But what is coin compared to the life of a child, compared to the terror that stalks the night? He offers payment plans: livestock, grain, labor. He exudes an unshakable confidence that feels like a lifeline to the drowning. He knows what to do. He isn't confused like the priests or dismissive like the distant philosophers. He speaks their language of tangible evil and physical solutions. He offers action where others offer only doubt or complex explanations about bacteria. Scholars still debate, how widespread and impactful were these professional vampire hunters? Were they common figures flitting from village to village, or relatively rare opportunists capitalizing on specific, localized panics? Did they actively incite exhumations that might not have happened otherwise, or merely provide a costly service for communities already determined to dig? Their existence highlights the entrepreneurial aspect of fear and the desperate need for perceived control in the face of the inexplicable. They were parasites feeding on a parasitic panic. You watch Grigor take a hefty down payment, a good milking goat, several sacks of grain. He pockets a few coins. He performs a quick, theatrical warding of the most afflicted house, chanting loudly in a mix of Latin-sounding gibberish, Greek fragments, and Slavic words he overheard, waving his herbs and sprinkling his dubious liquids. He promises to return at the auspicious hour, usually midnight, for maximum drama to deal with the source in the graveyard. As he strides away, a palpable, if fragile, sense of relief washes over the villagers. They have a champion. They have a solution. They've paid for her safety. Later that night, under a moon conveniently obscured by clouds, Grigor performs his grim ritual. It's a condensed, flashier version of the villagers' own practices, the stake driven with more theatrical grunts, the decapitation accompanied by a loud, improvised banishing chant, the garlic stuffed with exaggerated care. He might even produce a small bottle of accelerant to make the burning hard if he bothers to remove it flare impressively. It's less about genuine belief and more about justifying his fee and cementing his reputation. He collects the rest of his payment at dawn, perhaps offering a final, overpriced purification charm for the grave. "Rest easy now, good people," he proclaims, mounting his horse. "The evil is vanquished. But remember, vigilance. The shadows hold many secrets. Should darkness stir again, send word. Grigor will answer." And with that, he rides off towards the next terrified village, his satchel a little heavier, his pockets a little fuller, leaving behind villagers clutching their amulets, praying his expensive theatrics worked, and the fear, slightly reshaped, but far from gone. His performance provided a script, a cost, and a false sense of expert resolution. But the underlying terror, the profound questions about death and decay, those remained, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for a different kind of authority to address them, an authority not of theatrics or theology, but of the cold, slow, methodical light of science, finally beginning to pierce the murk not with a stake, but with a microscope and a textbook. Grigor's brand of snake oil was about to meet its most formidable opponent yet, the relentless march of medical understanding. Grigor's hoofbeats fade into the distance, leaving behind the scent of cheap lavender, theatrical smoke, and the lingering unease his expensive performance couldn't quite dispel. The villagers clutch their amulets, gaze warily at the graveyard mound now bearing his dramatic and costly mark, and hope. But the fear, like the damp earth, clings. Meanwhile, far from the muddy tracks of itinerant charlatans and the smoke-filled huts of terror, a different kind of battle against the vampire is being waged. It's quieter, less dramatic, but ultimately far more potent. You find yourself transported again, this time into the hushed, high-ceilinged lecture hall of a university medical faculty. Think Vienna, Leiden, perhaps Edinburgh. The air here smells of chalk dust, old books, preserving spirits, and the faint, astringent scent of anatomical dissection. Sunlight streams through tall windows, illuminating rows of young men and only men, in this era, faces earnest, pens poised over notebooks. At the front, a professor of medicine or anatomy, perhaps a man influenced by the great Hermann Boerhaave or the emerging spirit of systematic inquiry, adjusts his spectacles and clears his throat. The topic today not humors or miasmas, but something unsettlingly relevant, the so-called vampire phenomenon, a rational pathological inquiry. Mainstream history nudge. The mid to late 18th century saw significant strides in forensic pathology and the scientific understanding of decomposition. Building on earlier observations like those of the Habsburg field surgeons, prominent physicians and scientists began systematically compiling evidence and publishing detailed refutations of vampirism. Key figures included French Benedictine monk Antoine Augustin Calmet, whose works, while often credulous, compiled valuable data later used by skeptics, German physician Christoph Wilhelm Hufeland, and most decisively, Austrian Empress Maria Theresa's personal physician, Gerard van Swieten. Van Swieten's 1755 report, commissioned by the Empress herself, was a landmark rationalist demolition of the superstition, advocating for strict bans on exhumations and stakings. The professor's voice is calm, precise, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "Gentlemen," he begins, "we are confronted with reports from the eastern provinces, disturbing accounts of corpses deemed vampires due to certain post-mortem appearances, bloating, suppleness, the emission of sanguineous fluid, the apparent growth of hair and nails. These signs, interpreted through the lens of fear and ancient folklore, have led to abhorrent practices, desecration, mutilation, even immolation." He pauses, letting the gravity sink in. "Our task, as men of science and medicine, is not to mock the credulous, but to understand the phenomena they misinterpret. To replace superstition with pathology." He gestures to large, detailed anatomical drawings pinned to boards, perhaps contrasting a normal decomposition sequence with exaggerated depictions of the vampire traits described in reports. "Let us examine the evidence point by point, dissecting the claims with the tools of observation and reason, not hysteria. The fresh corpse, the assertion that corpses remain fresh or lifelike weeks or months after burial, is demonstrably false in the absolute sense. However," he concedes, "the rate of decomposition is highly variable. Factors such as soil composition, damp, clay-rich soil slows decay, sandy, well-drained soil accelerates it, temperature cold retards, warmth accelerates. Cause of death: infectious diseases like plague can produce rapid putrefaction internally while preserving the skin longer, drowning victims often bloat dramatically, and even the individual's physique and diet all play crucial roles. A corpse buried in cold, waterlogged ground might exhibit delayed external decay, creating the illusion of preservation. This is not vitality, it is the slowing of inevitable dissolution. The blood," he points to a drawing showing fluid seepage from a nose and mouth. "The dark, often viscous fluid reported, this is not fresh blood. It is purge fluid. As internal organs decompose, gases build up, creating immense pressure. This pressure forces decomposing liquefied tissues, blood serum breakdown products, and bacteria-laden fluids upwards and outwards through natural orifices, the nose, mouth, even the eyes. Its color can range from dark red to brown to black, depending on the stage and cause of death. Finding this fluid on a shroud is a sign of advanced internal putrefaction, not recent feeding. Bloating," he taps the distended abdomen in the drawing. "This is unequivocally due to gas accumulation. Bacteria within the gastrointestinal tract proliferate massively after death, producing methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other gases as metabolic byproducts. This inflates the abdomen, distends the features, and can even force the tongue to protrude. The taut skin and apparent plumpness, misinterpreted as being well fed, is simply the body inflated like a macabre balloon by microbial activity. Hair and nail growth, a persistent illusion," the professor states firmly. "After death, the skin, particularly on the scalp, face, hands, and feet, undergoes significant dehydration and retraction. As the skin shrinks and pulls back, it exposes more of the hair shaft and nail bed, making them appear longer and more prominent. It is not growth, it is revelation through shrinkage. Similarly, the observation of new skin beneath sloughing epidermis is simply the exposure of underlying dermal layers as the outer skin detaches, a natural stage in decomposition known as skin slippage." Weird little nugget. Doctors conducting these investigations sometimes noted the presence of a waxy substance called adipocere, grave wax forming on corpses in damp conditions. This soap-like substance, formed by the saponification of body fats, could preserve features for years, sometimes making a corpse look eerily intact. While not directly related to the vampire signs which focused on early decomposition stages, its discovery in older graves occasionally fueled separate undead legends centuries later, adding another layer of confusion to corpse lore. He moves to the heart of the terror, the wasting sickness attributed to vampire attacks. Correlating deaths after an exhumation does not prove causation, he emphasizes. Plague, typhus, tuberculosis, malnutrition, these scourges lingered. The psychological toll of terror itself, the belief one is being preyed upon, can induce profound physical decline, wasting, weakness, nightmares mimicking suffocation, the old hag phenomenon, well documented even today. To blame an exhumed corpse for subsequent deaths ignores the complex reality of disease, poverty, and the nocebo effect, the power of belief to induce illness. Scholars still debate, how long did it take for this medical understanding to effectively displace folk beliefs on the ground? Van Swiaten's 1755 report led Empress Maria Theresa to issue a decisive decree banning vampire exhumations and stakings under penalty of law. This did significantly curb the official sanction and large-scale public rituals within Habsburg territories. However, deep-seated folk beliefs and localized panics likely persisted in remote areas for decades, flaring up sporadically. The medical arguments provided crucial ammunition for authorities and educated elites to combat the panic, but completely eradicating centuries-old folklore intertwined with the trauma of death was a slower process. Was the medical victory primarily top-down, enforced by law, or did the sheer weight of scientific explanation gradually filter down? The professor concludes, removing his spectacles. The vampire is not a supernatural predator. It is a cadaver undergoing the complex, variable, but entirely natural, process of decomposition. The terror it inspires is a product of ignorance misinterpreted through the lens of ancient fear. Our duty is clear: to disseminate this knowledge, to educate, to replace the stake and the sickle with understanding and compassion, to ensure that grief is not compounded by desecration born of misunderstanding. He looks out at the students. Science illuminates the darkness, gentlemen. Even the darkness of the grave. The lecture ends. Students gather their notes, discussing the points in low voices. The scientific arguments are clear, logical, compelling. The professor has dissected the vampire myth with clinical precision, leaving only biology on the slab. Knowledge, not fear, is the weapon here. It feels like a turning point. The light of reason is finally piercing the fog of superstition with focused, systematic intensity. Decrees like Maria Theresa's, driven by such medical counsel, are actively banning the practices. The Grigors of the world are being pushed to the fringes. The panic, it seems, is finally receding under the relentless pressure of science and law. But as you step out of the lecture hall into the crisp air, a nagging thought persists. Knowledge travels slowly. Laws can be distant. Fear has deep roots. While professors lecture in Vienna and empresses sign decrees, in a remote village huddled against the Carpathians, a child coughs weakly. A mother watches, her eyes hollow with a dread no medical textbook can reach. The whispers start again, low and urgent, in a language of ancient terror the Enlightenment hasn't fully translated. The professor's light is bright, but the shadows in the corners of Europe are long and stubborn. The final, desperate gasp of the vampire panic isn't a whimper, it's a chaotic, violent convulsion, a last, bloody stand against the dawn of reason. The stench of smoke and panic is about to rise one more time, not as a wave, but as a final, defiant spasm. The professor's measured words hang in the antiseptic air of the lecture hall, a beacon of reason. Empress Maria Theresa's decree, inspired by Van Swiaten's report, lies crisp and authoritative on parchment in Vienna. Exhumations for the purpose of identifying and destroying supposed vampires are hereby forbidden under pain of severe penalty. Local authorities are commanded to suppress such practices and educate the populace on the natural causes of decomposition. The tide, it seems, has definitively turned. Science and law stand united against the superstition. The vampire, rationally speaking, is dead. But reason travels at the speed of a horse, a courier, a slow trickling rumor. Fear travels at the speed of a nightmare. And in the deep valleys, the isolated hamlets clinging to the slopes of the Carpathians or hidden in the forests of Transylvania, the year might be 1756, 1760, the news from Vienna feels as distant as the moon. The plague has receded, yes. But hardship hasn't. A hard winter kills livestock. A child sickens with a fever that doesn't break. An old man dies suddenly, clutching his chest. The familiar dread, momentarily suppressed by the distant decree or the memory of Grigor's expensive theatrics, coils back, tighter, colder. The whispers start, not as a ripple, but as a groundswell. It's back. Stronger. Angry because we stopped. It's taking them one by one. This time, it's not just one suspicious corpse. It's a cluster. A nest. A whole section of the graveyard feels wrong. The fear isn't just personal, it's communal, existential. The village feels besieged by an invisible enemy they believe is laughing at the emperor's piece of paper. Mainstream history nudge, despite the bans and scientific debunking, large-scale vampire hunts did flare up sporadically well into the latter half of the 18th century, particularly in the most remote and economically depressed regions. These events, like the infamous 1783 case in the village of Hermersdorf, now Harman, Romania, often involved the exhumation and treatment of multiple corpses in a single, frenzied event. They represented the panic's last, desperate gasp, communities pushed to the brink, reverting to old rituals in defiance of distant authorities and rational arguments they couldn't access or comprehend. It was tradition and terror overriding law and science. You feel the tension snap. This isn't a quiet, fearful exhumation like Maludin's. This is collective hysteria reaching critical mass. The village elders, perhaps old men who witnessed the first panics decades ago, declare a state of emergency. Forget the imperial ban. Forget the doctors. Their families, their village, is under attack. They muster every able-bodied man. Torches are lit, not just for light, but as weapons against the darkness. Axes, shovels, scythes, and yes, sharpened stakes are gathered. The blacksmith works the bellows feverishly, not for tools, but for more stakes, more blades. The air crackles with a terrifying energy, part terror, part grim resolve, part feverish desperation. This is a war council against the dead. They will cleanse the graveyard. Tonight. The procession to the churchyard isn't somber, it's a grim parade. Dozens of men, faces set in masks of fear and determination, women wailing prayers from doorways, children peeking with wide, terrified eyes. The torches cast long, leaping shadows that dance like demons on the church walls. The priest might be there, caught between his duty to the church which condemns this and his flock's palpable terror, perhaps muttering prayers for protection, his faith strained to breaking. The local magistrate, he is either hiding, powerless, or swept up in the frenzy himself. Imperial authority feels like a phantom here tonight. The digging begins. Not one grave. Many. The names are called out, the recently dead deemed suspicious, the long buried who died badly during past plagues, anyone whose grave feels cold or whose family suffers misfortune. The earth flies. Coffins are shattered open. The stench is overwhelming, a miasma of decay that makes eyes water and stomachs churn, but the panic fuels them, overriding disgust. You stand at the edge, the torchlight flickering on faces distorted by fear and effort. The scene is chaotic, nightmarish. Corpse after corpse is hauled onto the cold ground. Some show the signs: bloating, purge fluid, skin slippage. Others are merely skeletons or advanced mummies. It doesn't matter. In the torchlight, amidst the hysteria, every body looks unnatural, threatening. Confirmation bias runs rampant. A stiff limb moves as it's dropped, it struggles. A pocket of gas escapes with a groan, it cries out. The vampires are everywhere. The enemy is legion. Weird little nugget: in the frenzy, older folk practices resurfaced, sometimes more extreme. Beyond staking and decapitation, some accounts describe boiling the suspected vampire's head in vinegar or holy water, believing the steam would carry away the evil spirit. Others involved burying the body face down so it would dig deeper into hell, not towards the surface, or placing poppy seeds or millet in the coffin, the idea being the vampire would be compelled to count every single grain before leaving, delaying it until dawn. The sheer variety of neutralization methods highlights the depth of the fear and the absence of a single, universally trusted solution. The violence is swift, brutal, almost industrial. Stakes are driven into chests with heavy mallets, the thud-thud-thud a grim percussion against the wails and shouts. Heads are severed with heavy axe blows, rolling grotesquely. Garlic is crammed into mouths, eyes, wounds. Bodies might be piled together on a pyre, the stench of burning flesh and hair adding a new layer of horror to the night. The villagers work with frantic energy, a catharsis of terror transformed into violent action. They are reclaiming their village from the dead, one brutalized corpse at a time. The sheer scale is staggering. This isn't pest control, it's a massacre of the already departed. Scholars still debate, were these final large-scale hunts acts of defiant tradition, communities consciously rejecting distant imperial laws they saw as irrelevant to their survival, or were they manifestations of collective breakdown, societies pushed beyond endurance by hardship, isolation, and the lingering trauma of past epidemics? Reverting to primal rituals, did the very act of banning the practice paradoxically make it more attractive as an act of local autonomy in some regions? The motivations behind these last convulsions remain complex and debated, reflecting the messy intersection of law, tradition, trauma, and belief. Dawn breaks, cold and grey, over a scene of utter desecration. The graveyard is a churned field of mud, shattered coffins, and charred remains. The villagers stand amidst the wreckage, breathing heavily, covered in grime and soot. The frenetic energy ebbs, replaced by a hollow exhaustion and a dawning sense of, what relief perhaps, but also a profound unease. The violence they perpetrated is immense, visceral. The stench of death and burning hangs heavy. The imperial soldiers will come eventually, drawn by reports of mass grave desecration. There will be consequences. The children who watched will carry this night's horror forever. The fragile bonds of community are strained, perhaps broken, by the shared act of violating their own dead. As the weak sun struggles through the clouds, illuminating the carnage, the victory feels Pyrrhic. They believe they've won. They believe they've burned the evil from their soil. But the cost is etched on every weary, haunted face. The terror that drove them hasn't vanished, it's mutated, mixed with guilt and the looming threat of imperial punishment. The bans from Vienna, the lectures from professors, the logic of decomposition, they all feel achingly distant in the cold light of this grim dawn. The vampire panic hasn't ended here with a whimper, it's ended with a brutal, bloody spasm, a final, violent argument against the encroaching light of reason. The physical acts are over, but the echoes reverberate. Why did it come to this? Why here? Why then? The questions hang in the acrid air, demanding answers not from the grave, but from the tangled web of history itself. It's time to step back, high above the mud and the blood and the burning pyres, and look at the bigger picture, the perfect storm that brewed this unique nightmare in the heart of the Enlightenment. The acrid stench of the final pyres fades, carried away on the wind over the scarred graveyard. The echoes of the last desperate blows, stake on bone, axe on neck, die into an uneasy silence. The soldiers may come, the decrees may be enforced, the guilt may linger, but the physical violence, the mass exhumations, the public stakings, they belong to the past now. The vampire panic, as a widespread, violent phenomenon, is receding into history. You stand, not in the mud of a violated graveyard, but on a metaphorical hilltop, high above the 18th century. The view is panoramic, stretching back decades, even centuries. The frantic terror of the villagers, the baffled reports of officials, the scathing wit of Voltaire, the earnest lectures of physicians, the charlatan-esque theatrics, the theological hand-wringing, they swirl below like pieces of a complex, disturbing puzzle. The question hangs heavy in the clear air of hindsight: why then, why did this specific, virulent strain of corpse terror erupt with such ferocity in the heart of the age of reason? What unique alchemy of history brewed this perfect storm? It wasn't a single ingredient. Think of it as a catastrophic recipe, simmering for generations, brought to a violent boil in the early 1700s. One, the lingering cauldron of plague and death. This is the fundamental broth. The 18th century wasn't the end of mass mortality, it was the tail end of centuries dominated by it. The Black Death 14th century cast a long shadow, but localized plague outbreaks, typhus, smallpox, dysentery, and rampant infant mortality were still brutal realities, especially in rural, impoverished Eastern Europe. The Little Ice Age, roughly 1300 to 1850, exacerbated this: harsh winters, failed harvests, famine, malnutrition. Death wasn't an abstract concept, it was a constant, intimate companion. Communities were repeatedly shattered, grief was cumulative, and the randomness of who lived and who died felt capricious, demanding explanation. The trauma of mass death created fertile psychological soil where the idea of the dead actively causing death could take root. The vampire wasn't born in peace, it was forged in the crucible of relentless loss. To the shattered worldview, wars and religious upheaval, pour in centuries of conflict. The Ottoman Wars ravaged the Balkans for generations, leaving devastation, displacement, and deep cultural scars. The 30 Years' War 1618 to 1648, though centered further west, shattered Central Europe, leaving economic ruin and social dislocation in its wake. Then came the Great Northern War 1700 to 1721, again impacting Eastern Europe. These conflicts weren't just political, they were religious wars, shaking the foundations of Christendom. The Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation had created competing certainties and profound anxieties about salvation, the soul, and the afterlife. Traditional communal structures and religious certainties were fractured. In this environment of profound instability and spiritual unease, older, localized folk beliefs about the restless dead like the Nox Error gained new potency. They offered a framework, however terrifying, to explain ongoing suffering in a world where divine order seemed broken. 3. The information paradox: faster rumors, slower facts. Now, add a twist of technological irony. The 18th century saw a significant expansion of travel and communication. Roads improved slightly, trade networks grew, peddlers, soldiers, and migrants moved more frequently. Crucially, newspapers and cheap pamphlets proliferated in urban centers. This meant terrifying rumors from remote villages could travel faster and further than ever before. A localized panic in Serbia could become sensational news in Vienna, Leipzig, or Paris within weeks. However, accurate information, medical knowledge, official decrees, rational explanations traveled much slower, especially reaching the isolated, often illiterate rural populations where the panic was strongest. Villagers heard distorted, terrifying tales of vampires from distant places, reinforcing their own fears, long before a doctor's rational explanation or an imperial decree could arrive. The media, primitive as it was, amplified the fear while failing to effectively disseminate the cure. For the uneven reach of enlightenment, sprinkle in the dissonance of the era itself. The age of reason was brilliant, but its light was uneven. While Voltaire mocked in Paris and professors lectured in university halls, vast swathes of rural Europe remained steeped in pre-Enlightenment worldviews. Literacy was low. Access to education, especially scientific education, was minimal for peasants. Traditional folk beliefs and oral histories held immense power. The Enlightenment's rationalist challenge to superstition was real and growing, but it was a top-down phenomenon, initially impacting elites and urban centers. The villagers digging up Maludin weren't rejecting Newton, they'd likely never heard of him. The gap between the cutting edge of reason and the deeply ingrained folk consciousness of the countryside created a vacuum where panic could flourish. Science offered answers, but they hadn't effectively penetrated the places that needed them most. 5. The specific spark, plague resurgence and official reports, finally, light the fuse. The early 18th century saw resurgent plague outbreaks in southeastern Europe, e.g. the Great Plague of Vienna in 1713, outbreaks in the Balkans. This wasn't just any death, it was the return of the ultimate medieval horror. The trauma was acute, immediate, and devastating. And crucially, it was documented officially. Habsburg military surgeons and administrators, operating in these plague zones, wrote detailed reports describing the exhumations and the unnatural state of corpses, the bloating, the blood, the lack of decay, without initially providing the correct scientific context. These reports, intended as bureaucratic records, were leaked, published, and sensationalized. They lent an air of official, quasi-scientific credibility to the phenomenon. If imperial surgeons saw it, if it was written down and stamped, how could it not be real? This unintentional validation from authority figures was arguably the critical accelerant that turned localized folk practices into a widespread panic. Weird little nugget, the vampire geography, the panic wasn't random. It clustered remarkably in specific regions: eastern Austria, Styria, Carinthia, Hungary, Transylvania, Serbia, parts of Poland. Scholars note this overlaps strikingly with areas heavily impacted by the Ottoman Habsburg military frontier zones, Krajina, places marked by constant warfare, population displacement, mixed ethnicities, and the collision of different folk traditions: Slavic, Germanic, Romanian. It also overlapped with regions affected by ergotism, St. Anthony's fire, a fungal poisoning from moldy rye that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene, potentially fueling visions of demonic attacks or the undead. Was there something uniquely potent in this cultural and environmental cocktail? Scholars still debate. The precise weighting of these factors is contentious. Was plague the essential trigger, without which the panic wouldn't have ignited, or was the cumulative trauma of war and social dislocation more fundamental? Did the Knox error belief actively cause the panic, or was it merely the available script? How crucial was the role of official documentation like the Visum et Repertum in transforming local fears into a continental phenomenon? Was the panic primarily a rural versus urban divide, or did class and education play a larger role than geography? The perfect storm metaphor is apt, but historians still argue about which storm cell was the deadliest. Looking down from your historical vantage point, the picture clarifies. The 18th century vampire panic wasn't a sudden eruption of primitive stupidity. It was the tragic convergence of deep-seated trauma, fractured worldviews, the unintended consequences of emerging communication networks, the stark limitations of pre-modern medicine, the uneven spread of Enlightenment ideals, and the specific catalyst of documented plague horrors colliding with ancient folklore. It was a crisis of explanation in the face of unbearable suffering, a desperate lashing out against the terrifying randomness of death using the only tools physical and conceptual available. The villagers weren't ignorant savages, they were traumatized people acting on beliefs that made terrifying sense within their shattered world. As the smoke of the last fires clears from your historical vista, a new perspective emerges. The fear recedes, the stakings cease by law and understanding, the vampire fades from graveyards, but it doesn't vanish. It migrates. It sheds its folkloric skin of shroud-eating and family predation, it becomes something else, a metaphor, a gothic trope, a fictional monster polished by poets and novelists. The visceral terror of the Noxerer buried in Serbian soil transforms into the aristocratic predator haunting castles in English literature. The story isn't over, it's changing channels. The bones, however, remain. Literally. They lie in forgotten graves, under church floors, in archaeological storage boxes. Silent witnesses to a time when the dead were believed to walk. And it's to these bones, and the quieter echoes of the panic, that we turn next, bridging the gap between the terror of the past and the understanding of the present. The echoes of the perfect storm fade, the plague's death rattle, the cannon's roar, the peddler's cry, the villager's desperate wail. The frantic energy of the panic dissipates, leaving behind a profound quiet. Not the silence of resolution, but the stillness after the tempest. You step out of the swirling currents of the 18th century and into a different kind of space. The air is cool, dry, hushed. It smells faintly of dust, disinfectant, and the quiet, mineral scent of time itself. You're in a modern museum storage room, or perhaps a university archaeology lab. Stark fluorescent lights hum overhead, illuminating rows of metal shelves holding carefully labeled boxes. Or maybe you're looking at a photograph on a screen, a skeletal hand resting on dark soil, a skull tilted at an unnatural angle, surrounded by the meticulous tools of excavation. These are the silent protagonists of our story, the bones. The very bones that once fueled a continent's terror. A white-coated archaeologist or conservator moves with deliberate care. She opens a long, shallow box lined with protective foam. Inside lies a skeleton. It's not monstrous. It's human, achingly human. Fragile. Finite. The bones are yellowed with age, stained by centuries in the earth. But look closer. See the heavy iron scythe blade placed deliberately across the neck vertebrae. Notice the large, rough stones positioned on the pelvis, the ribs, the knees. See the dark stains around the jaw that might be remnants of a substance crammed into the mouth long ago. This isn't a random burial. This is a vampire burial. Not a myth. A tangible, archaeological fact. A testament to the depth of the fear that gripped a community, perhaps centuries ago. Mainstream history nudge. Physical evidence of these anti-revenant practices is being uncovered with increasing frequency by archaeologists across Eastern and Central Europe. Sites like Drosko, Poland, Klavica, Poland, Perpericon, Bulgaria, and numerous locations in the Czech Republic and Romania have yielded skeletons treated with the telltale signs. Heavy stones or bricks pinning the body, iron sickles or scythes placed across the throat to decapitate if the corpse sat up, stakes driven through the torso sometimes found rusted nearby, bodies buried face down, and residues suggesting garlic or other substances in the oral cavity. These burials provide concrete, physical proof of the rituals documented in the 18th century reports, dating both from the peak panic and earlier periods. They are the silent, skeletal archives of fear. The researcher points to the scythe blade. This wasn't grave goods, she says softly, her voice respectful in the quiet room. It was a weapon. Left there intentionally, A permanent restraint. She gestures to the stones. Waits. To pin the body, prevent it from rising. She might indicate the jaw. Soil analysis sometimes reveals traces of allicin, a compound found in garlic concentrated around the mouth area. Each object, each position, speaks a silent, chilling language. This person wasn't just buried, they were imprisoned within their own grave, subjected to post-mortem rituals designed to neutralize a perceived monstrous threat. Looking at these bones, you don't see a vampire. You see a fellow human being, likely someone who died under circumstances that terrified their community, perhaps suddenly, perhaps during a plague, perhaps just differently. Their final rest was violated by the profound, collective dread of those they left behind. The weight of those stones feels heavier than stone, it feels like the crushing weight of centuries of fear. Weird little nugget: in 2004, archaeologists in Venice excavating a 16th-century plague mass grave on the island of Lazaretto Nuovo found a skeleton with a brick deliberately wedged into its mouth. This vampire of Venice became a global news sensation. While debated, the leading theory is precisely this: it was an attempt to stop a suspected noxera or vampire from eating its shroud or biting the living. It's a visceral, 500-year-old snapshot of the exact fear that fueled the later panics, proof the belief predated the 18th century explosion and persisted in diverse locations. A single brick, speaking volumes about the intimate horror of the hungry grave. Yet, standing here, surrounded by the quiet hum of modern science, the atmosphere isn't terrifying. It's contemplative. Somber. The tools of understanding have changed. Where villagers saw monstrous signs, pathologists see taphonomy, the science of decay. They can analyze soil chemistry, reconstruct burial environments, identify the precise stages of decomposition that caused bloating or purge fluid. They can run DNA tests to uncover plague bacilli or other diseases that might have caused the suspicious death. They can carbon date the bones, place them precisely in time. The microscope and the mass spectrometer have replaced the stake and the sickle. The fear hasn't vanished from history, but it has been transformed into data, into understanding, into a profound lesson about the human condition under duress. Scholars still debate. Interpreting these burials requires nuance. Archaeologists constantly grapple with questions. Was every skeleton buried with a sickle or stones a suspected vampire? Could some weights have had other symbolic meanings? Could some prone burials indicate social stigma or punishment unrelated to revenant fears? How do we distinguish genuine anti-revenant measures from coincidental grave inclusions or later disturbances? The challenge lies in avoiding over-interpretation while recognizing the compelling pattern that aligns perfectly with historical accounts of the vampire panic. Each new discovery adds a piece, but the puzzle of individual motivations and local variations remains complex. The bones are evidence, but their full story requires careful, contextual reading. The researcher gently closes the box, returning the bones to their quiet darkness. The act feels like a gesture of respect, a laying to rest not just of the individual, but of the terror that surrounded them. The vampire, as a literal, blood-drinking corpse stalking villages, has been consigned to the realm of folklore and fiction by the relentless light of scientific understanding. We know the biology. We understand the psychology of mass panic. We see the historical context. But the story endures. It endures in the crumbling pages of the Visum et Repertum, in Voltaire's scathing prose, in the silent stones pinning bones in forgotten graves. It endures because it speaks to something primal within us, the fear of death, the terror of the unknown, the desperate need to control the uncontrollable, the heartbreaking vulnerability of loving those we must lose. The vampire panic wasn't just a historical anomaly, it was a dark mirror reflecting the depths of human fear and the lengths we go to in order to feel safe, even if it means violating our own dead. The journey ends here, not with a stake, but with a quiet click of the storage box latch. The frantic energy, the communal terror, the clash of superstition and reason, all settle into the dust of history. The bones rest. The fear that animated them is understood, if not entirely erased from the human heart. We walked through the graveyard of the past, felt its chill, understood its shadows. Now, it's time to leave the dead to their rest and step back into the softer light of the present, carrying not fear, but the quiet weight of understanding. The story of the vampire panic is over. But the night, and the need for stories within it, remains. Let the final whispers be gentle ones. The echoes of the perfect storm fade, the plague's death rattle, the cannon's roar, the peddler's cry, the villager's desperate wail. The frantic energy of the panic dissipates, leaving behind a profound quiet. Not the silence of resolution, but the stillness after the tempest. You step out of the swirling currents of the 18th century and into a different kind of space. The air is cool, dry, hushed. It smells faintly of dust, disinfectant, and the quiet, mineral scent of time itself. You're in a modern museum storage room, or perhaps a university archaeology lab. Stark fluorescent lights hum overhead, illuminating rows of metal shelves holding carefully labeled boxes. Or maybe you're looking at a photograph on a screen, a skeletal hand resting on dark soil, a skull tilted at an unnatural angle, surrounded by the meticulous tools of excavation. These are the silent protagonists of our story, the bones. The very bones that once fueled a continent's terror. A white-coated archaeologist or conservator moves with deliberate care. She opens a long, shallow box lined with protective foam. Inside lies a skeleton. It's not monstrous. It's human, achingly human. Fragile. Finite. The bones are yellowed with age, stained by centuries in the earth. But look closer. See the heavy iron scythe blade placed deliberately across the neck vertebrae. Notice the large, rough stones positioned on the pelvis, the ribs, the knees. See the dark stains around the jaw that might be remnants of a substance crammed into the mouth long ago. This isn't a random burial. This is a vampire burial. Not a myth. A tangible, archaeological fact. A testament to the depth of the fear that gripped a community, perhaps centuries ago. Mainstream history nudge. Physical evidence of these anti-revenant practices is being uncovered with increasing frequency by archaeologists across Eastern and Central Europe. Sites like Drosko, Poland, Klavice, Poland, Perpericon, Bulgaria, and numerous locations in the Czech Republic and Romania have yielded skeletons treated with the telltale signs. Heavy stones or bricks pinning the body, iron sickles or scythes placed across the throat to decapitate if the corpse sat up, stakes driven through the torso sometimes found rusted nearby, bodies buried face down, and residues suggesting garlic or other substances in the oral cavity. These burials provide concrete, physical proof of the rituals documented in the 18th century reports, dating both from the peak panic and earlier periods. They are the silent, skeletal archives of fear. The researcher points to the scythe blade. This wasn't grave goods, she says softly, her voice respectful in the quiet room. It was a weapon. Left there intentionally. A permanent restraint. She gestures to the stones. Weights. To pin the body, prevent it from rising. She might indicate the jaw. Soil analysis sometimes reveals traces of allicin, a compound found in garlic concentrated around the mouth area. Each object, each position, speaks a silent, chilling language. This person wasn't just buried, they were imprisoned within their own grave, subjected to post-mortem rituals designed to neutralize a perceived monstrous threat. Looking at these bones, you don't see a vampire. You see a fellow human being, likely someone who died under circumstances that terrified their community, perhaps suddenly, perhaps during a plague, perhaps just differently. Their final rest was violated by the profound, collective dread of those they left behind. The weight of those stones feels heavier than stone, it feels like the crushing weight of centuries of fear. Weird little nugget: in 2004, archaeologists in Venice excavating a 16th-century plague mass grave on the island of Lazaretto Nuovo found a skeleton with a brick deliberately wedged into its mouth. This vampire of Venice became a global news sensation. While debated, the leading theory is precisely this: it was an attempt to stop a suspected noxera or vampire from eating its shroud or biting the living. It's a visceral, 500-year-old snapshot of the exact fear that fueled the later panics, proof the belief predated the 18th century explosion and persisted in diverse locations. A single brick, speaking volumes about the intimate horror of the hungry grave. Yet, standing here, surrounded by the quiet hum of modern science, the atmosphere isn't terrifying. It's contemplative. Somber. The tools of understanding have changed. Where villagers saw monstrous signs, pathologists see taphonomy, the science of decay. They can analyze soil chemistry, reconstruct burial environments, identify the precise stages of decomposition that caused bloating or purge fluid. They can run DNA tests to uncover plague bacilli or other diseases that might have caused the suspicious death. They can carbon date the bones, place them precisely in time. The microscope and the mass spectrometer have replaced the stake and the sickle. The fear hasn't vanished from history, but it has been transformed into data, into understanding, into a profound lesson about the human condition under duress. Scholars still debate. Interpreting these burials requires nuance. Archaeologists constantly grapple with questions: was every skeleton buried with a sickle or stones a suspected vampire? Could some weights have had other symbolic meanings? Could some prone burials indicate social stigma or punishment unrelated to revenant fears? How do we distinguish genuine anti-revenant measures from coincidental grave inclusions or later disturbances? The challenge lies in avoiding overinterpretation while recognizing the compelling pattern that aligns perfectly with historical accounts of the vampire panic. Each new discovery adds a piece, but the puzzle of individual motivations and local variations remains complex. The bones are evidence, but their full story requires careful, contextual reading. The researcher gently closes the box, returning the bones to their quiet darkness. The act feels like a gesture of respect, a laying to rest not just of the individual, but of the terror that surrounded them. The vampire, as a literal, blood-drinking corpse stalking villages, has been consigned to the realm of folklore and fiction by the relentless light of scientific understanding. We know the biology. We understand the psychology of mass panic. We see the historical context. But the story endures. It endures in the crumbling pages of the Visum et Repertum, in Voltaire's scathing prose, in the silent stones pinning bones in forgotten graves. It endures because it speaks to something primal within us: the fear of death, the terror of the unknown, the desperate need to control the uncontrollable, the heartbreaking vulnerability of loving those we must lose. The vampire panic wasn't just a historical anomaly, it was a dark mirror reflecting the depths of human fear and the lengths we go to in order to feel safe, even if it means violating our own dead. The journey ends here, not with a stake, but with a quiet click of the storage box latch. The frantic energy, the communal terror, the clash of superstition and reason, all settle into the dust of history. The bones rest. The fear that animated them is understood, if not entirely erased from the human heart. We walked through the graveyard of the past, felt its chill, understood its shadows. Now, it's time to leave the dead to their rest and step back into the softer light of the present, carrying not fear, but the quiet weight of understanding. The story of the vampire panic is over. But the night, and the need for stories within it, remains. Let the final whispers be gentle ones.